Everybody. Welcome back to English 112, and this is our class for the 8th of December for Tuesday, and we are talking about poetry. You can see in the notes below I've included some information about assignments, so I should have caught up with all of the assignments that were submitted to me prior to this weekend. I should have been able to evaluate them and return them back to you, with the exception of any revisions you might have submitted. So if it turns out that you think that you have submitted in an assignment prior to this weekend that I did not return to you, please contact me because it might have gotten lost somewhere along the way. And in terms of the revisions, I will be working on those as soon as I can. Keep in mind that for the revision, you needed to submit the original graded copy along with the revised copy so that I could compare the two. And if you're not sure if you're missing any assignments, just contact me and I'll be happy to let you know. Paper number 2, drama, is going to be due this Thursday on the 10th of December. If it turns out you needed a little bit of extra time, I could give you a bit, but not much, because we are headed towards the very ending of the semester, believe it or not, now that we are in December. Paper number 2 should be very similar to paper number 1 in terms of the length, 4 to 5 pages, and again, a critical paper where you are examining some sort of an idea or theme in one of the 3 plays that we've read, either Oedipus the King or Midsummer Night's Dream or ultimately A Raisin in the Sun. And I would have asked during the attendance questions a bit about what you were thinking about in terms of that particular paper. And you wouldn't have an opportunity to revise that paper, paper number 2, but everybody has the opportunity to revise paper number 1, and that revision will be due at the very ending of the semester. In terms of poetry, we will put closure to poetry on the 15th, which happens to be a Tuesday, and we will have an extension for when that journal will be due up until Wednesday the 16th. And certainly you can hand in your journals early. Journals very similar to what you've been doing with journals with short story and with drama, in that you would be selecting 3 poems in the poetry unit and writing about a page or so in response. And I would be evaluating informally and on a checkmark system, but ultimately I will return that back to you so that you've got it for the final examination. The final exam will be posted on the 22nd of December. So that would have been the time that would have been selected for us by the college if we were meeting in person at 10:30 a.m. That will be posted. You'll have 24 hours in which to finish that particular final. If we were meeting in person, you would have 2 hours to take that final, and I would give you an additional hour if you needed additional time. So 3 hours maximum is what you should expect for that final. I don't expect you working on it for 24 hours. Just wanted to give you a little bit of time to complete it. It's open book, open notes, so use whatever resources you think can be useful to you, including your journals and my comments on those journals. And the bulk of the final, 80 points, will be based on poetry, where I will select a handful of poems and ask you to choose 2 and to analyze, or what is known as explicate, which sounds like explain, to talk about anything and everything in the poem that seems to be important. These would have been poems that we would have covered in class. The best way to study for the final is basically to review all of our class notes and review all of our class videos. And while ultimately the focus is on poetry, there will be a 10-point question on drama and a 10-point question on short story, in order for us to basically have a holistic examination about the entire semester. But since you wouldn't have had time to write on poetry, the focus, or a paper on poetry, the focus of the exam is on poetry. And keep in mind as well that another good way to prepare is to read all of the comments on the discussion boards from yourself and your classmates and my responses to them, because basically everything would have been covered in one of those places. The author to her book by Anne Bradstreet is a poem that I wanted to discuss today. Now, we started talking about Shakespeare, not too surprising that I would begin with the Shakespearean sonnet, considering my fondness for Shakespeare. And then we moved on to Andrew Marvell, to his coy mistress. And we talked about metaphysical poetry, poetry that is deliberately outlandish and that tries to push boundaries. And we saw how that was happening within that particular poem. But I wanted to give you another poem from the 1600s, 1678, the author to her book. Now, this would be the third poem in approximately the same time period. This is a time period that I'm particularly fond of, and that's one of the reasons probably why we've got 3 poems from this time period and only 1 poem from the 1700s that will follow. So I admit my bias here. But the reason why I wanted us to talk about Anne Bradstreet, and you can see that if you are using our textbook, that's on page 692, but I've also included a link from the Poetry Foundation, which is a great resource for finding poetry, so that if you don't have access to the textbook, you can still access her poem, and those are in the notes below. And one of the reasons why I wanted to assign this particular poem is because even though it was written in the 1600s, it was written by a female. And that would be somewhat unusual during this time period. Unusual for a woman to write, and even more unusual for a woman to be published. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to showcase this particular poem. It also is a great example of an extended metaphor. We've talked about metaphors over the course of the semester where you are comparing 2 dissimilar objects and you're trying to show the commonalities between them. You're not using the words like or as. If you were, technically that would be a simile. This poem is a metaphor, and it's an extended metaphor because the entire poem keeps up this comparison between 2 seemingly dissimilar things. Raising a child is compared to writing and publishing a book. And I wonder if it's one of the reasons why Anne Bradstreet was able to get her poem published, because she's talking about a task that oftentimes is very much associated with female, birthing and child rearing. That said, the task of writing and publishing would not necessarily be associated with female. And as you know, my recommendation for these poems is to read them out loud so that you can hear the rhythm. And I'm going to read this poem out loud to you. The author to her book, 1678, by Anne Bradstreet. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. And better dressed to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father ask, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. Now you can probably hear the rhyme that's included in this particular poem, and you can see that the textbook talks about, immediately underneath the poem, the extended metaphor likening her book to a child came naturally to Bradstreet, allowed her to regard her work both critically and with affection. Her conception of the book as her child creates just the right tone of amusement, self-deprecation, and concern. So we're already given a little bit of information about this poem by the editors of the textbook. And if we were going to explicate this poem, if we were to go through it word by word and line by line, and in theory, we could write a 5 or 6 page paper on this poem if we wanted to. Again, we're not writing a paper, but at least some of the things that could be important. Notice how she talks about this offspring, this creation of her writing, as ill-formed. In other words, this is something that she views as negative because she's not happy with the product of her feeble brain. Again, so there's a lot of criticism or self-deprecation here. Who after birth didst by my side remain. And if you think about the idea of a child, and a child could be viewed as an ill-formed offspring, And a child does remain by the mother's side initially after the child is born, just like a piece of writing remains by our side after it is completed. Till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad expose to public view. And that ultimately individuals will take your writing from you and expose it to the public. And if you think about your own experiences as a writer in, let's say, an English class, that's exactly what happens. You have to show your writing to your peers or to a tutor, eventually to an instructor. And for her, she needs to show her writing to editors before it ultimately is approved for publication. And of course, with the child, the same is true. You can't keep a child forever. Eventually, you're going to have to release that child to family, other family members and friends who will expose that child to public view. Made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. This idea that outsiders, when they're reviewing your work, whether it be your creation of a human being, a baby, or it be the creation of something that you've written, there's always this level of judgment that's associated with it. At thy return my blushing was not small. My rambling brat in print should mother call. And notice where I'm stopping at the semicolons. Just because a line ends with the comma, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the ending of the line. It continues on in the following line. And the fact is that the child and the piece of writing will come back to you. And then ultimately you might be blushing a little bit out of embarrassment with the way that your child or your piece of writing has been evaluated by others. A rambling brat, she calls it. In other words, she's unable to control her writing, just like she would be unable to control, perhaps, a child. I cast thee by as one unfit for light. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. So this sense of her frustration with the child, or also her frustration with her writing. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. The sense that this belongs to her, so she wants to try to correct the errors or the frailties that exist within the child or the writing. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I don't know if you've ever experienced this in your writing and trying to edit it and make it better. You actually make it worse. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. There's a little bit of a pun here, not just the idea that a child has feet and can run, but also when we talk about poetry and we talk about the beat and the syllabication within a poetry, we're talking about the feet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. So again, the idea of trying to dress up the child to make the child more presentable, but that's not going to change the personality of the child. Same with a piece of writing. You could try to dress it up with fancy paper or fancy font, but that's not going to improve the level of the writing. But naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. Besides, she doesn't have anything for any finery for the child to wear or any, let's say, parchment paper for the paper itself when it's going to be presented to editors or publishers or teachers. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam. This idea of roaming and not being able to control. So if somebody's ever said that your writing is scattered, that's the idea. And of course the child roaming and can't be controlled, looking for something. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where thou art not known. And ultimately, everybody's a critic, to try to stay away from that, but ultimately people will be evaluating you based on your product, whether it's your writing or your offspring. If for thy father ask, say thou had none. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. So this sense here that this is a single mother, there was no father, which would be somewhat unusual in 1678. How does that compare to a piece of writing? And that ultimately we as creators of the writing should be doing this alone. Certainly we can have help from others, but it should be our own production. Just like a woman is able to give birth, obviously not by herself, but the idea of the birthing process itself is from her and her alone. So same sort of connection. So what Bradstreet is doing, almost like the poem Catch, which we had talked about earlier, is drawing a parallel between two things that seem to have no connection, and in fact they do have a connection. And then the last line, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. Eventually, you've got to release your writing because you want it to be published so that you can earn a paycheck. And eventually, you need to send your child out into the world so that they can take care of themselves. And you aren't responsible for continuing to rear them. So I thought that was a very interesting poem, again, in terms of the female author, as well as the extended metaphor of birthing and raising a child being very comparable to writing and publishing a text. And we've got some humor there as well, and some self-deprecation. Now, as we move forward to something like The Sick Rose by William Blake. William Blake is one of those canonical authors. If you remember, we talked about this in the beginning of the semester. Those authors that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study. So William Blake is a very famous author that you might have heard of before, a very famous poet. And he is known as a romantic poet. And the romantic poets weren't necessarily talking about romance in the terms of love. The romantic poets were basically focused on an examination of nature and the natural world. And you will see that definitely in The Sick Rose by William Blake. Now, this particular poem was not included in the most recent version of your textbook. It is in some of the older versions. But I would have, if we were meeting in class, given you a handout with the content of these poems. But instead, now you've got a link so that you can access that, also from the Poetry Foundation. And I wanted to read this poem to you. It's a very short poem. And as we talked about, poetry is very dense. So sometimes the shorter the poem, the more complex it is. It's only 2 stanzas. And we talked about a stanza being much like a paragraph. So that when you see a division there, a new stanza would indicate a new topic or a new idea, just like a new paragraph does a new topic or a new idea. And The Sick Rose, written in 1794 by William Blake, is: O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. And while the vocabulary of the words are fairly simple, trying to understand the meaning of this poem, it may not necessarily be simple. And I know at this point in the semester, you're looking for hidden meaning. Might I suggest that The Sick Rose can be read quite literally, that this is indeed about a flower, a rose that's sick because of its attack by insects, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, that's found out thy bed, the rose bed of crimson joy, since roses are oftentimes associated with red, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. That basically the insects and the worms that live off of the rose ultimately destroy the rose so that they can continue on living. It's part of the food chain, whether we like it or not. But of course, outside of the literal, we also have the possible symbolic. And as we were talking about Rose for Emily, and we were generating ideas about what a rose could mean. Yes, it could mean a flower. A flower is delicate, but it also has thorns. In other words, it can hurt and it could be very dangerous. But Rose is also the name of a woman. And this could be perhaps a poem written to someone named Rose. Thou art sick. And why is this particular woman sick? The invisible worm that flies in the night. A worm could be perhaps a phallic symbol. In the howling storm. And storms and howling oftentimes have been associated with erotic moments. Has found out thy bed. In other words, they've had some sort of an illicit relationship, either because the woman already is married or because she's virginal and is unmarried and her virginity is being taken from her. Of crimson joy, and if the virginity was taken from her, then there probably would be some loss of blood. And his dark secret love, and this could be the lover. Does thy life destroy her reputation, for instance? We talked about this in Midsummer Night's Dream and the importance of virginity for female in particular. Or perhaps it isn't about a lover, but perhaps it's about some sort of societal ill. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night it could be some sort of plague, but it could also be some sort of socioeconomic ill that flies in the night in the howling storm ultimately has destroyed you. And if we were to talk about this poem, I think it would be important to talk about not just the possible symbolism of the poem, but also the literal. Because remember, the Romantic poets at the time were observing the natural world around them, that the natural world was basically evidence of spirituality and religion and God and beauty, and would comment on what they would see. I liken it to somebody writing a poem about a sunrise because they're just so struck by its beauty. And while someone else reading the poem might argue that that perhaps is a symbol of the rising and falling of something, perhaps nations, you as the poet maintained that it was simply an observation of a sun rising. And I would say that both perspectives could be equally valid. Remember when we talked about at the beginning of the semester that an author doesn't necessarily have to have a perspective or an interpretation that agrees with the reader. In fact, the reader might have a very different interpretation, and it would be valid if the reader could support that particular interpretation with evidence from the text. So, in terms of this particular poem, and the Romantics in general, I think you can read the Romantics quite literally as a celebration and observation of the natural world. But you should also, as well, think about possible symbolic meanings. And as we move forward, I'm afraid only one poem for the 1700s. I admitted my bias. And then we move forward to a poem that I knew we would have to discuss, or at least a poet I knew we would have to discuss. Emily Dickinson, who's become basically an icon in New England and especially in the Amherst area. The Emily Dickinson House is in Amherst, and I encourage you to visit if you have the opportunity to do so. And her poetry comes usually with a lot of myth-making about the writer herself, as she's known as Miss Emily, the woman in white, because she was known to favor white, who basically led a reclusive life. In some ways, it almost reminds me of the Sorrowful Woman, who basically kept herself at home and communicated with individuals through notes. It seemed absurd when we were reading The Sorrowful Woman, but this is something that Emily Dickinson actually did. She was college educated, which would have been unusual for a woman at the time. She came from a very wealthy and prominent family in Amherst, but she never married and never had children and never started a family, which would have been seen as very unusual. She openly declared that she didn't necessarily believe in organized religion. That too would have been very unusual during the time. And in fact stopped attending church. And attending church was more than just a spiritual activity. It was a political and a social activity. So it was rather daring and bold of her to make those declarations. And she spent most of her time alone in her room writing poems, thousands and thousands of poems actually. And she never had those particular poems published. She just kept them bound up in little packages. And then when she died, her sister found them all in a bureau. And her sister, with an editor, published some of them. And unfortunately, the way they were published is that the editor made corrections to the poetry so that they would fit the conventions of grammar and mechanics. And one of the things we were talking about in the beginning of the semester is in the beginning of this unit, is how do we define poetry? And one of the things we indicated is that poetry doesn't necessarily have to follow conventions. And certainly when a poet makes an editorial decision not to follow a grammatical convention, there's a reason for it. Not just because they don't understand what the grammar is, but they're usually making some sort of a statement. And with Miss Emily, you can tell very clearly if you are reading one of her edited poems or what she actually wrote. What ended up happening in the 1950s or so, an editor by the name of Johnson published all her poems in the way she originally wrote them, with all of the mechanical, for lack of a better word, errors, but these were deliberate. And ultimately her poetry became much more raw and much more interesting. And probably the biggest indicator of her poetry is that she doesn't like to use commas. She uses dashes instead. So you can tell very quickly if you're reading something that Miss Emily wrote as opposed to something that was just edited by Emily Dickinson. If you see the dashes, that means Emily wrote it at the ending of lines. She also has irregular capitalization, oftentimes favoring the capitalization of nouns. So that too is a sign that Emily wrote that particular poem. And she oftentimes writes about death. So some people think of her as a negative poet. I wouldn't say that at all. She views death more often than not in her poetry as a positive, because it's a transition into another life, into a life of eternity. And while she didn't believe in organized religion, she very much believed in spirituality. And while her poetry was very personal and oftentimes used the I, it's also universal, because she talks about deep emotional states that all of us have experienced. And this particular poem, also I've given the link in the Poetry Foundation, or it would have been in a handout that we would have had if we were meeting in person, and I will read that poem to you. Or actually, no, it's not in a handout. It actually is in our text. Page 847. Sorry about that. And on page 847, if you have the text, or you could go to the link, you will see her poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And what's interesting is she never titled any of her poems, so we refer to her poetry by the first line. This is very similar to Shakespeare's sonnets. He too never titled his sonnets, so we refer to the sonnets by their first line. Sometimes sonnets are referred to by their number, because editors have tried to organize the sonnets and put them in numerical order. That is not the case with Emily Dickinson. So instead, what we've got is a reference to the poem based on its first line. And the poem reads, and this was written in 1863 by Emily Dickinson: Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And perhaps you can hear the internal beat or rhythm within that. Actually, she oftentimes used the rhythm of hymnals, which was again considered rather bold, because she wasn't necessarily writing a spiritual song. That said, her poetry is very spiritual, but not in terms of the organized religion of man. And if you're not quite sure how to deal with this particular poem, and if you're looking at this poem now, you can see that many of the lines end with that very notorious dash that I was referencing. But you can see at the bottom of the poem, there's several questions to help guide you. Why couldn't the speaker stop for death is the first question. How is death personified in this poem? So this gives you an idea that death is personified. And personification means giving human qualities to a non-human thing. In this instance, death is given human qualities. How is death personified in this poem? How does the speaker respond to him? Or as death is referred to as a male. That's very typical in literature. Why are they accompanied by immortality? Number 3, what is the significance of the things they passed in the third stanza? Which means that you should pay attention to that third stanza. 4, what is the house? Notice house is capitalized in lines 17 to 20. And 5, discuss the rhythm of the lines. How is the rhythm of line 14 related to its meaning? And as we go through here, the first stanza says, again, reference to the I couldn't stop for death. Death is capitalized and personified. In other words, we don't get to decide when we die. Death decides for us. It's something we have to passively wait for. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. So when death comes for her, she references death as kind, which is something we don't usually think of with death. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So death brings immortality. This idea of riding in a carriage to a journey that would end with one's life is a common literary trope that oftentimes is used. In fact, we even saw it with Oedipus the King when he was on his journey, for instance. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. In other words, when you are approaching the afterlife, you don't need to worry about earthly concerns such as time and things like being late or rushing. So they drove slowly. He, death, knows no haste. And I had put away my labor, my leisure too, for his civility. So now death has been called not just kind, but civil. So there's a positive associated with death. And now she is talking about no longer needing to worry about labor and no longer needing to worry about leisure, because those are earthly concerns. And in fact, the only reason why we need leisure is because of labor. None of that exists in the afterlife. And then we go to the third stanza. We pass the school where children strove at recess in the ring. And that's supposed to represent youth, the stage of life where children are playing outside at recess in the ring. If you've ever heard of Ring Around the Rosie, which actually, that particular game for children, it's about plague, so it's a rather dark game. Children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. That's supposed to represent adulthood, the stage of life we're in now, where we might be working the fields and collecting grain. We pass the setting sun, and that's supposed to represent the final stage of life, old age, where basically the setting sun represents the ending. Or rather, he passed us. The sun passed them as they continue on. The dews drew quivering and chill. And now that the sun isn't out, it's becoming quite chilly there. There's a transition that's going on in terms of the time of the day and the temperature and the weather, as well as a transition for this person moving from the earthly realm to the spiritual realm. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We do get a definition for tippet, which is shawl. Tulle is a very thin, transparent fabric. It's what tutus are made out of, for instance, wedding veils, things of that nature. And her gown is only made out of gossamer, which is also a very thin and transparent kind of substance. So the idea is that even though it's cold outside, she's wearing very thin fabric. And one of the reasons why is because we see her transition again from the earthly realm to the spiritual realm. That in the earthly realm, you feel things like temperature. That's the reason why we wear clothing. And of course, social convention. She no longer needs that as she's moving into the afterlife. We paused before a house that seemed the swelling of the ground. The word house is capitalized. It's oftentimes been thought of to perhaps represent a church, or it could perhaps also represent a crypt. The house that seemed the swelling of the ground. In other words, that it's so far away that it just seems to be a tiny swelling on top of the ground. So they're moving farther away from the earthly realm, more into the spiritual. And the roof was scarcely visible. That's how far they are. And the cornice, which happens to be an architectural element of a roof, the cornice was in the ground. Again, if you're so far away, what you're really going to see is just the very tip of this house, whether it be a crypt or whether it be a church. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. In other words, this happened centuries ago. But again, since there is no time in the afterlife, it feels shorter than the day. Now, if this happened centuries ago, this means she is speaking from the perspective of death. This is the proof that there is an afterlife, because she's speaking from the afterlife, remembering back when she transitioned from the earthly to the spiritual. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And certainly the horses would be drawing the carriage as she's on her journey, that metaphorical journey of life. But this is also a biblical reference as well to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So even though she wasn't necessarily religious, she did know her Bible and would oftentimes use things like the patterns of church hymnals or references, biblical allusions. So that's one of the reasons why I chose this particular poem, is because, quite frankly, it's a poem that I think I understand and is understandable. Many of Emily Dickinson's poems aren't understandable, and even the critics who study Emily Dickinson admit that they can't necessarily understand all of her poetry because it is so personal. So I know that tends to frustrate readers, and usually what I suggest is, rather than trying to understand the poem in its whole, just focus on a particular element. Sometimes a line or two can be so incredibly powerful. And that in and of itself can be very satisfying. So I think about one of my favorite lines that oftentimes is, quoted in things like graduation ceremonies, and it has at GCC. I dwell in possibility. I think about the idea of dwelling as in obsessing over, but also living in, and possibility. And again, that idea of hope and opportunity, and how well that would work for something like a graduation. Just one line, 4 words, and yet it has such a wealth of meaning. And I think you'll find that with Emily Dickinson. So with the exception of Dickinson, up until this point, we've been focusing on British authors. And we are going to have a transition into American authors. And more importantly, we're going to have a transition as we hit the 1900s, where the poetry is going to be not just more contemporary, but it will be based on some of the history of poetry. In other words, paying homage to some of the masters. And also it'll be trying to break some of the rules and the conventions that have been established in the past. I liken it to contemporary musicians who will oftentimes say that they were influenced by musicians of the past. So to truly understand the contemporary musicians' music, you need to know the musicians of the past. But what they're doing is they're putting their own spin on it. And that's definitely the case with what we're getting with poetry. And I thought to reflect that transition that we will be entering into next class, I would go out of the chronology, because I've tried to give poems that followed a chronology up until this point, and gave a poem entitled American Poetry by Louis Simpson in 1963. So I'm way off of the chronology here. Again, this is a poem that would not have been included in your textbook, but would have been included in the handout that I would have assigned. So you can reference it through the link that I've got below if you are relying on your textbook. And I think this poem very nicely summarizes the transition we are going to see from some very classic and contemporary poetry to some poetry that really is trying to defy conventions and break boundaries. Though, of course, Emily Dickinson did some of that with her Grammar and Mechanics. An American Poetry by Louis Simpson, 1963. Whatever it is, it must have a stomach that can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. It must swim for miles through the desert, uttering cries that are almost human. The tone of this poem is very dark, ominous, foreboding, perhaps suggestive that this is going to be the tone of much of the poetry that we will be reading from the 1900s. And also, since the title of the poem is American Poetry, the suggestion is that poetry from the United States, from America particularly, is like this. And when we read the first line, whatever it is, it must have, you might think, well, this is confusing. I don't know what is being referenced because of the pronoun it. And if you received a paper back from me where I circled the pronouns such as it or he or she, and I said, unclear pronoun reference, it what, be concrete. What I meant was within that sentence, you used a pronoun, but there wasn't the noun in the sentence that indicated what the pronoun was replacing. The noun, honestly, was probably in the previous sentence. So from your perspective, it might have been clear. But you should evaluate each sentence grammatically as a unit, not necessarily in combination of all of the other sentences, but just one sentence in isolation. So if you used a pronoun and it wasn't clear what noun you were replacing, then I probably would have done that. Now, of course, with poetry, you can break those rules. So we've got this line here, whatever it is, it must have. But it's not too difficult to tell what the it is if we go to the title, because that is the noun that the it is replacing, whatever American poetry is. Whatever it is, it must have a stomach that can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, and poems. Now, there can be this kind of negative connotation or association with stomachs and digestion, but also it's part of the life force and something that's necessary. But look at what's being digested. Rubber, coal, uranium, moons, and poems. Now, many of these words are things that are particularly associated with the United States. Rubber. You'll remember Walter Lee talking about in Raisin in the Sun, saying, what are you going to do, run a rubber plantation and be a man? In other words, industry. Coal, another industry of the United States, dirty energy as we know it now. Uranium, which is actually used for nuclear weapons, for destruction. Moons, and if you think about the time in which this poem was written, 1963, and the first man on the moon in the moon race in the United States. So all of these things are associated with the United States. They come with negatives, though perhaps with positives as well. And all of those are linked up with poems. In other words, the subject of poetry can be rubber, coal, uranium, and moons. And moons oftentimes have a romantic element associated with them in poetry, that you look beautiful in the moonlight. But you don't usually expect to talk about rubber or coal or uranium in a poem, like Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which very much fits the expectations of what we expect with romantic poetry. So in other words, this is our heads up, if you will, that now poetry can talk about anything and everything. Dirty things, ugly things, destructive things, anything and everything is appropriate. And like a shark, this is what American poetry is like. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. If you know anything at all about sharks, and they're predators and they consume anything and everything. It could have been that it just ate a shoe. It could have been that it actually ate a person and all that's left is a shoe. It must swim for miles through the desert. Now, of course, you can't swim in sand. That's an oxymoron. Perhaps that's what ultimately poetry is, filled with contradiction. Or if you wanted to swim through the desert, think about the kind of effort that would need to be expended to try to do such a thing. And maybe that's what American poetry, and might I suggest the poetry of the 1900s is, something that's going to require a good amount of effort from you. Uttering cries that are almost human, again, very negative, very ominous, almost bestial and monstrous. And perhaps that is what American poetry will be, and what the poetry of the 1900s will be. So I thought that this poem, American poetry, even though it's not as well known as the other poems, would make a good transition for us next class. Though we'll begin with a poem that follows lots of conventions, and that happens to be The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, a poem that you may have some familiarity with. But just because you have familiarity with it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an understanding of it. It's very similar to the Shakespearean sonnet, in that the road not taken is oftentimes misread. So we'll talk about how it's misread. We talked about with the Shakespearean sonnet, it's oftentimes misread, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, that the assumption that the poem is being written to a woman and that it's about trying to woo her. And that's not the case at all. It's written probably to a young man, the Earl of Southampton, to try to compliment him, because the patron, the Earl of Southampton, is providing Shakespeare with money and political support. At least that's what scholars have determined. But even if the scholars are wrong, there never is a pronoun that references a gender. All we get is thou, which means you, which means it's very general and very open-ended and can apply in a multitude of situations, which is one of the reasons why I think the Shakespearean sonnet is so powerful and so often quoted, because it's so adaptable. But next class, we'll talk a little bit about The Road Not Taken and how oftentimes that poem is misinterpreted. So we'll continue on. I hope you're well. I'm well. And next class, we'll begin with Robert Frost. Take care. Bye-bye.